Good afternoon. Nice to have you here, online or offline. So we continue today's workshop on digital platforms and Global South. Yesterday we had the first session on, I would say, more institutional aspects, how industrial or cultural actors, but also the states cope with digital platforms. Today, for the second session, we change the perspective a little bit. The emphasis will be put rather on cultural and digital workers who work for these digital platforms. And the session begins with Alix Bénistant. I have the great pleasure to introduce Alix Bénistant, who is assistant professor at the University of Paris 13. Alix will talk about the cultural crowdfunding platforms in Latin America. Yesterday, we had papers on Nigeria, India, and Latin America. And today, we come back to the Latin American case. Alix, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tristan, and to Christine and Philippe for the invitation and the organization of this workshop. So my presentation today focuses on a particular type of platforms, a term I will re-examine in the conclusion, the crowdfunding platforms. Quickly, to give a general definition of crowdfunding, according to Paul Belflam, it is a process whereby an entrepreneur raises external financing from a large audience, the crowd, in which each individual provides a very small amount instead of soliciting a small group of sophisticated investors. So in this presentation, I will look deeper into the reflections carried out within the framework of the Collab project. This 3 years project focused on cultural crowdfunding platforms. A specific focus was placed on the international dimension, with research fields conducted in France, in the US, in Africa, and Latin America. This international axis was part of a critical perspective focusing on the power relations between North and South, and where crowdfunding platforms were understood as one of the apparatus of the creative economy, supported by major ideological discourses that circulate on a global scale. This will lead me to articulate 3 scales of observation: the macro scale, how crowdfunding fits into a context of global development of a collaborative creative economy; the meso scale, how platforms have been established and developed in Latin America and what public policies have supported this local implementation; and the micro scale, what does this mean for project owners? Methodologically, I based my work on reading reports from national and international institutions and on interviews conducted with political actors, platform owners, and project initiators. About 25. So the development of crowdfunding in Latin America is part of a global dynamic and has taken a particular important place in the region. The first Latin American crowdfunding platforms were created in 2011, following the success of large US platforms such as Indiegogo and Kickstarter. Their emergence was made according to the 3 main models of participatory financing: reward-based, peer-to-peer lending, and equity crowdfunding, which corresponds to capital investment. You see here the distribution between these 3 forms of crowdfunding from 2010 to 2015 globally. Also, the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance reports that across all platforms, the cumulative amount of money raised in the region to fund projects has reached a total of $1.81 billion in Latin America. Here is the increase per year since 2013, and it should be noted that 93% of the region's volume comes from 6 key countries: Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Argentina. What thing seems important to emphasize in this first macro perspective is these platforms are part of the attempt to develop a collaborative economy made possible by the development of the web on a worldwide scale with strong inequalities, obviously. And this collaborative economy is itself part of a large-scale deployment of a creative economy, which, as Kate Oakley reminds us, has become since the end of the 90s a truly globalized discourse. In that way, there is a will to make economy, culture, and technology converge. Another important thing to note right now is that collaborative platforms, which rely on the creative potential that each individual will have, fit particularly well with the different forms of informal economies that will exist in the global south. The 2016 report by FOMIN, which is the Multilateral Investment Fund, a group of the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. This report, entitled Crowdfunding and Mexico, directly insists on this point. It explains that crowdfunding is particularly well rooted in habits of collective action. Here they said the proliferation of collective action to achieve common goals is an indication of the right cultural disposition for the adoption of crowdfunding. The practice of the tanda is particularly pointed out, a form of short-term interest-free loan between friends, which can be found under different names in Latin America: Condidas en Mexico, Juntas en Peru, Cuchubales in Salvador y Guatemala, and Poyas in Chile. Hence, the inflation of reports published in this sense by various international institutions, and in particular in Latin America, by the IDB. In fact, this transnational institution based in Washington has produced and participated in the writing of more than a dozen reports. They all point in the same direction, especially around the notion of economía naranja, which directly concerns culture. Here, we can read that the orange economy is a development model in which cultural diversity and creativity are pillars of social and economic transformation of the country from the regions. This model has cultural, social, and economic development tools. It is based on the creation, production, and distribution of cultural and creative goods and services, which can be protected by intellectual property rights. We can see here what the critics of creative rhetoric have shown. So the critics of creative rhetoric have shown it is seen as a vehicle for the export of neoliberal policy prescriptions, including, but not limited to, urban competitiveness, marketization of the arts, and the shrinking of the public sphere. So in the continuity of this criticism, one can then question on the political implications of this global policy transfer. How has this materialized in specific public policies in specific territories? How have these discourses been appropriated in different Latin American countries? So three short perspectives in this part. Many initiatives have been taken locally in Argentina and Mexico, carried or supported by public actors in this direction. So this is done through a multiplicity of devices and events where entrepreneurs, cultural workers, and SMEs have a central role. I could thus quote the following examples without going into the details of their organization and functioning, but we have the MICA in Argentina, which is the Mercado de Industrias Culturales Argentinas, carried since 2011 by the Secretariat of Cultural Development of the National Ministry of Culture. In continuation, the Fondo de Desarrollo Cultural y Creativo was created with the website CINCA, Argentina's cultural information system, and to support the formation of a creative network at a national level. In the same direction, Mexico has created the Oficina de Estrategia Digital Nacional, and which works directly with the IDB through FOMIN. It organizes the annual Entrepreneurship Week and has also supported the creation of AFICO, and the Association of Crowdfunding Platforms. And Rogelio Castillo, an IDB employee, explained to me in an interview that the aim of all these events and different kind of devices is to accelerate crowdfunding in Mexico, calling on all the political, economic, and social actors who can help, providing technical assistance and training. Our mission is to ensure that everything necessary for the development of crowdfunding is created. Finally, from a transnational perspective, the MICSUR, Marketplace of Cultural Industries of the South, can be mentioned. It is held every 2 years until 2014. And the aim is the same as MICA, but on a regional scale. And it is this transnational perspective that has encouraged the development of the IDEAME platform. It is a leader in cultural creation in Latin America. Its aim was to compete with the US platform Kickstarter, which remains dominant throughout the continent. Created in 2011 in Argentina and Chile, with its headquarters in the United States, it is now established in 6 countries: Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Uruguay, and Brazil. But beyond supporting the development of the platform in several territories, there is a political issue at stake. Sebastien Di Lullo, its CEO, whom I met in Buenos Aires, explained that the ministry wants to start reaching out to artists and show them that culture cannot only exist if the paternalistic state provides money, but that the people, the community, can help us, and that the hand of the state and the community through crowdfunding can make cultural projects sustainable. I think this is a very important element, which was confirmed in another interview at the Argentinian Undersecretariat for the Creative Economy, to get out of an overly European management of art and culture. And that is where the public authorities remain the main financial backup. The aim is to make the cultural sector more dynamic by stimulating local creation by a multitude of small entrepreneurs. To support these dynamics and provide a framework for these practices, the various states have had to adapt their legislation. And Mexico was a pioneer in Latin America in terms of regulation. After 2 years of work, in March 2018, the FinTech law was published. The objective is to regulate online financial exchanges and control the actors that take it on, and ultimately to create trust in these services. Laws of this kind have been developed in several countries, in Brazil, Colombia, or very, very recently in June 2021, after 5 years of work in Peru. But gradually, the idea has emerged to think about these issues at the level of economic communities, as for example, within the Pacific Alliance. In this sense, the IDB produced a report in May 2021, in which it suggested the creation of a multi-jurisdictional sandbox that would allow a sort of transnational legislative common pot, promoting the logic of regional integration. So we can see here this rise in scale from national to transnational to regional. And there is a desire to create a common regional market where fintech players, including crowdfunding, could deploy transnationally without obstacles. So to conclude this presentation, we can then ask what all these dynamics produce on the creators themselves. And this we could return to a critical approach to public policies and actors' strategies in the context of the collaborative economy should also be seen in relation to the material dimensions of creative cultural activity. For the past 20 years, many works have questioned the transformation of work and contemporary wage employment. They show that most of them have come from the worlds of art and culture. You will find an interesting synthesis about music in the following dossier. So these works show that the characteristics of artistic work in an entrepreneurial regime are fractionalized employment relationship, project-based organization of work, inequalities of income and reputation that are both very important and considered legitimate, total but ephemeral commitment to the activity, selective pairings, and uncertainty and individualization of singular talent. Now, it is then difficult to recognize the image of the emancipated and creative worker of the new economy carried by the very managerial rhetoric that we have studied above. And indeed, this is what we found when we interviewed project leaders in Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil with Jeremy Vacher, who was part of the project and with whom I continue to work on these issues. Like the characteristic of creative work mentioned above, the situations are very different depending on the social background of the project leader, his integration in the sector, his geographical location, or his age and the degree of professionalization of his artistic practice. And I can give as an example the case of Eric Castillo, a young writer interviewed in Mexico City. He was conducted a fundraising campaign for his first novel. So it was just an example to show what we were saying earlier, that crowdfunding fails to give everyone a chance, including those who do not have sufficient social, economic, and symbolic resources to access established publisher or producers. It only reproduces or even exacerbates the inequalities that existed before. This is also pointed out by Kate Oakley when she discusses the progressive possibilities of the idea of creative industries in its first incarnation. And she states, the claim of social benefits, which have traditionally been as much a part of the cultural policy offer as claims for economic growth, have proved not only unfulfilled, but in many cases, these developments have exacerbated the very problems they claim to address. So we could multiply the example highlighting these observations, but we don't have the time for right now, but they all show this tendency to reproduce and even increase social inequalities in the crowdfunding industry and more broadly in the so-called collaborative economy. So, conclusion. The case of crowdfunding shows that a specific platform model is being deployed on several levels in a global context of liberalization of cultural financing methods. This model is developing in different ways in the many countries where it is taking place, and thanks to the support of local public policies. But in seeking to promote the same creative spirit, we can see that the perspectives of regulation are increasingly taking place in a transnational framework. We can then ask if the hegemony is not to be found precisely in this model, proposed and promoted at the global level, a model that establishes organizational modalities of production and cultural work from the north. One can finally see this model as being characteristic of the platforms of intermediation between the creator and the public. Public become financer. They do not intervene in the cultural content itself. This calls into question the generic theme of platform. Indeed, the model we have presented here is very different from that of the so-called SVOD platforms, such as Netflix or others, which play a very structuring role in the production of content. Thank you.
Thank you, Alix. To you, it was a fascinating study.